Do you live in Albany, Schenectady, Troy, or anywhere along the Hudson Valley in eastern New York? Do you have family in Columbia County, Rensselaer County, or the towns of Amsterdam, Cairo, Germantown, or Hunter? If the answer is yes, you need to watch this full video because what just happened in your backyard is being called one of the most extreme rainfall events in the recorded history of the region, and the danger has not fully passed. A slow-moving summer storm parked itself directly over eastern New York and simply refused to leave, and by the time it finally began to weaken, it had rewritten the record books, destroyed a 300-year-old grist mill, forced water rescues by boat and front-end loader, and left at least 2 people dead just across the state line. This is the story of how a single stalled weather system turned an ordinary Tuesday into a flash flood emergency that emergency managers are now comparing to some of the worst flooding disasters the Northeast has ever seen. It started with something meteorologists call blocking, a dome of high pressure set up shop to the east of New York, and it acted like a wall. Normally, a storm system like this one would move through in a matter of hours, dumping its rain and pushing out to sea. But this storm had nowhere to go. The high pressure blocked its exit, and so the storm did something far more dangerous. It stalled directly over the Hudson Valley and the capital region, and it began regenerating thunderstorm after thunderstorm over the exact same patch of already saturated ground. Meteorologists call this training, the same word used for a train where each car follows the exact same track as the one before it. Except here, each new band of thunderstorms followed the same path as the last, dropping rain on soil that had no capacity left to absorb another drop. But here's the problem. When rain falls on ground that is already full, it does not soak in. It runs. It pools. It rises in creeks and streams within minutes, not hours. And that is exactly what happened across Columbia County, Rensselaer County, Greene County, and Montgomery County as this storm sat in place hour after hour, refusing to move on. The numbers that came out of this event are almost hard to believe. In the town of Schodack, New York, just south of Albany, rain gauges measured close to 12 inches of rainfall from this single storm. Think about that for a moment. That is more than double the amount of rain the region typically sees during the entire month of July. 12 inches of water falling, not over weeks, but concentrated into roughly 2 days. At Albany International Airport, the storm dropped more than 6.5 inches of rain, and officials confirmed it was the biggest 2-day rainfall total ever recorded at that location, surpassing every storm, every hurricane remnant, and every nor'easter in the airport's entire period of record. On the single wettest day of the event, Albany measured 5.45 inches in 24 hours, making it the second wettest day ever recorded there, behind only the 5.6 inches that fell during the remnants of Tropical Storm Floyd back in 1999. It also broke the record for the wettest July day in Albany's history, a record that had stood since Tropical Storm Bertha soaked the region back in 1996. Most people are missing this next part. Records like these are not just numbers on a chart for meteorologists to admire. Every fraction of an inch above what the ground and the drainage systems were built to handle becomes a real, physical problem for real families. Basements filled with water while people slept. Roads that were dry pavement 1 hour became impassable rivers the next. And in low-lying neighborhoods along creeks that residents had lived beside their entire lives without incident, the water rose so fast that some people had only minutes to react. Here is why this is serious for anyone who thinks their home is safe, just because it has never flooded before. Hydrologists who study these events point out that a stalled storm like this one does not care about a property's flood history. It creates flash flooding through sheer volume and duration, overwhelming culverts, storm drains, and creek banks that were engineered for a completely different rainfall era. Streams that a family might cross on a footbridge every summer without a second thought can rise several feet within 30 to 45 minutes when a storm like this parks itself overhead, and that speed is exactly why flash flooding kills people who never received or never had time to act on a formal evacuation order. This next part matters. In Castleton-on-Hudson, a small community along the Hudson River, an abutting creek surged with 3 to 4 feet of water and slammed directly into the oldest section of a grist mill that had stood on that property for roughly 300 years. The mill's owner, Andy Klein, said a neighbor pounded on his door around 8 in the morning to warn him the water was rising. He watched the structure come apart in real time. He described it as watching a piece of history being physically torn apart in front of him. The oldest portion of the mill, a building that had survived hurricanes, nor'easters, and 2.5 centuries of Hudson Valley weather, could not survive this storm. The local water treatment plant in Castleton-on-Hudson was also damaged in the flooding, forcing officials to issue a boil water advisory for residents in the area. Meaning, on top of flooded homes and washed-out roads, people in that community woke up unable to trust the water coming out of their own taps. Now the focus shifts to the emergency declarations, because this storm did not just cause damage in one town. It triggered a cascade of states of emergency across the region. Columbia County, just south of Albany, declared a county-wide state of emergency as flooding overwhelmed local, county, and state roadways in what officials called many areas simultaneously. County leadership urged residents to avoid all unnecessary travel. In the town of Germantown, officials issued their own local emergency declaration. In Cairo, travel restrictions were put in place and remained active for days, with Town Hall itself closed through the end of the week because the building and the roads leading to it were compromised. In Hunter, in the heart of the Catskills, another state of emergency followed. And in Montgomery County, the city of Amsterdam saw roadways wash out entirely, with erosion tearing into infrastructure so severely that the city's Department of Public Works had to shut down an entire stretch of West Main Street near the train station, rerouting drivers onto side roads just to keep traffic moving at all. This is where it becomes dangerous for people who think flooding only means water in a basement. In Coymans, located just north of Hudson, New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services deployed swift water rescue teams to reach flooded homes. Responders helped evacuate 2 adults and 2 children from a house that had become surrounded by rising water. In Putnam County, rescue crews used a front-end loader, heavy construction equipment normally used for moving earth, to physically drive through floodwaters and pull a family out of their home. Photographs released by the local fire department showed the house nearly encircled by water that had risen high enough to reach the bumpers of the cars parked in the driveway. In Guilderland, video captured by a local news affiliate showed vehicles stranded in the middle of what used to be a road, with multiple streets closed off entirely because of the depth of the water covering them. Most people are missing this too. Just 2 weeks before the storm, the same general pattern had already given the region a warning shot. Torrential downpours flooded lower Manhattan, western Brooklyn, and Queens after days of smoke and heat had baked the city, submerging vehicles above the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway and forcing New York City officials to postpone a Yankees game entirely. New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani's office urged residents and visitors to remain vigilant at the time, warning that the storm event was not over and that people needed to stay safe. That earlier flood should have been a signal of what was coming. Instead, less than 2 weeks later, an even more extreme version of the same setup arrived, and this time it stalled directly over the capital region instead of moving through the city and out to sea. One more thing you need to know, this was not contained to New York. As the same storm system pushed southward and eastward, it brought catastrophic flooding into New Jersey and Pennsylvania as well, and that is where this event turned fatal. In New Jersey, a 10-year-old boy was swept into the Passaic River, which was running unusually high because of the same relentless rain. Rescue crews recovered his body, and at last report, a search remained underway for a 10-year-old girl who had also been caught in the same fast-moving water. A man in Monroe Township, New Jersey, was struck and killed by lightning during the same storm system. In Pennsylvania, in the small community of Coalport, crews from the Rescue Hose and Ladder Company responded to a flooded residence and pulled 3 people and 2 dogs to safety. These are not statistics. These are families who went to bed on an ordinary summer night and woke up, or in some cases never got the chance to wake up. In the middle of a life-threatening emergency, they had no way to predict with that kind of precision. Even in places that avoided the worst of the destruction, the fear was real. On Staten Island, multiple cars became stranded in floodwater late one night, prompting the New York City Fire Department to respond to a wave of calls in a single evening. In Newark, New Jersey, police and firefighters responded to reports of 5 separate cars trapped in high water, rescuing every driver and passenger without injury, according to the city's public safety director. Flooded roads, stranded vehicles, and additional water rescues were also reported across parts of New Jersey and Pennsylvania over the same 48-hour window, meaning emergency crews across 3 states were simultaneously stretched thin, responding to calls faster than some agencies could keep up with. But that is not the real story, either. Not entirely. The real story is what this storm did to travel and infrastructure across an entire region that depends on the Hudson Valley corridor to move people and goods every single day. Amtrak was forced to suspend service entirely on its Hudson line, the route connecting Albany, Rensselaer, with Penn Station in New York City, because of high water and debris sitting directly on the tracks in Columbia County. Trains simply could not run. Passengers were left stranded or forced to find alternate transportation with little notice. At the same time, more than 200 flights were canceled at New York City area airports on a single day, and across the full span of the storm, flight tracking services linked the system to nearly 2,000 total cancellations across the region, grounding travelers at LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark Liberty International all at once. Even Saratoga Racecourse, one of the oldest and most storied venues in American horse racing, was forced to cancel a full day of racing because of the storm. Here's why this is serious beyond just this one week. This storm did not happen in isolation. It arrived as part of what has become a relentless pattern across the Northeast and much of the country this summer. Earlier in July, West Virginia declared its own state of emergency after 7 inches of rain fell in just 6 hours in Upshur County. The Texas Hill Country experienced deadly flooding in mid-July, coming less than a year after the catastrophic July 4th, 2025 disaster in the same region that killed at least 139 people. New Jersey itself has now endured multiple fatal flood events across 2025 and into this year, including deaths in the city of Plainfield, a community whose low-lying geography, threaded by multiple brooks and streams, has made it a recurring flashpoint in the region's accelerating flood crisis. Each of these events, separated by hundreds of miles and different watersheds, shares the exact same atmospheric fingerprint. A weather system stalls. The ground is already saturated from the storm before it, and the rain simply has nowhere to go but into people's homes. This is where the science becomes impossible to ignore. Meteorologists who study long-term data have documented that the specific atmospheric pattern behind this storm, a stalled jet stream configuration that causes weather systems to hover over the same geography instead of moving through it, has become nearly 3 times more common since the 1950s. The leading explanation researchers point to is the shrinking temperature difference between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes, because the Arctic has been warming faster than the rest of the planet for years now. That narrowing temperature gradient weakens the jet stream, and a weaker jet stream is a more easily disrupted jet stream, one that is far more prone to buckling and stalling instead of flowing steadily west to east the way it used to. Layer on top of that a strong El Niño, which forecasters have flagged as a record probability pattern for 2026, and you get exactly the kind of atmosphere capable of producing back-to-back rapid-fire flash flood emergencies, each one fed by the same stalling mechanism working on the same supersaturated ground. El Niño years tend to shift the jet stream's typical path further south and further into a wavier, more erratic configuration across the eastern half of the country, and when that wavier pattern combines with a warmer atmosphere that is physically capable of holding more water vapor before it releases it as rain, the ingredients stack in a way that favors exactly this kind of stalled, high-output rainfall event rather than the faster-moving summer storms the region used to experience more routinely a few decades ago. This next part matters if you want to understand why forecasters were so alarmed even before the rain started falling. In the days leading up to the storm, the National Weather Service placed more than 36 million people across the Northeast under flood watches, stretching from Philadelphia through the New York metropolitan area and into southern and western New England. Forecasters warned at the time that the system could drop more than a month's worth of rain in some locations, and they specifically flagged the lower Hudson Valley and western New England as the areas most likely to see bands of rain slow down or stall entirely, which is precisely the mechanism that ended up producing the worst damage. In the 48 hours before the peak of the flooding, there were 84 separate flash flood reports logged across the eastern United States, with upstate New York recording the highest rainfall totals of any region monitored. That is not a normal severe weather day. That is a system large enough and slow enough to overwhelm an entire multi-state corridor at once. Let this next part sink in, because history has already shown this region exactly what a storm like this is capable of when it truly maximizes its potential. Go back to August of 1955. Hurricane Connie made landfall on the North Carolina coast, and just 5 days later, Hurricane Diane followed almost the exact same path. Connie alone dropped more than 10 inches of rain at Slide Mountain in the Catskills, saturating the ground completely. Then 5 days later, Diane moved directly into the Hudson River Valley and dropped over 19 inches of rain in Westfield, Massachusetts. The result was, at the time, the worst flood disaster the lower Hudson Valley of New York and the state of Connecticut had ever experienced. Rivers across the region crested at flood stages that had never been recorded before or since in some locations. That disaster happened because 2 storms stacked on top of each other over saturated ground, the same basic mechanism driving what just happened this week, just compressed into a single system instead of 2. Go back even further to the very origins of the Schoharie Valley communities that keep reappearing in this region's flood history. Back in 1869, a massive flood, what locals at the time called a freshet, tore through the village of Gilboa and destroyed the Gilboa Cotton Mill Company, along with much of the surrounding infrastructure. That same waterway, Schoharie Creek, went on to claim 2 more major infrastructure failures in the following century. In 1987, 2 full spans of the New York State Thruway collapsed directly into Schoharie Creek during a flood event, a disaster that killed multiple travelers and forced a complete re-engineering of how the state assessed bridge safety over waterways prone to this kind of surge. The pattern across nearly 200 years is consistent. When this specific geography, steep Catskill terrain funneling rainfall into narrow valley creeks, receives an extreme and sustained rainfall event, the results are catastrophic, almost every single time, regardless of the decade or the century. And it is not the only historical warning this region carries. In August of 2011, Hurricane Irene tore through the same Catskill and Hudson Valley terrain, and the flooding it caused was severe enough to collapse the old Blenheim Bridge over Schoharie Creek, a covered bridge that had stood since the 1800s, gone in a matter of hours. More recently, in July of 2023, Flooding across the broader Northeast killed 11 people and caused an estimated $2.2 billion in damage across New York and Vermont, setting what had been considered the modern benchmark for this type of event. A benchmark this week's storm arrived frighteningly close to matching in terms of the atmospheric setup, even if the death toll so far has been lower. Emergency officials who lived through 2023 have said openly that the ingredients behind this week's storm, a stalled system, a saturated atmosphere, and terrain across the Catskills and Hudson Valley that naturally concentrates rainfall into narrow creek basins, were the same ingredients, almost exactly. Now the focus shifts again, because as the worst of this storm finally began to pull away from eastern New York, it did not simply disappear. It shifted its full force directly into New England. More than 11 million people across the region, stretching from upstate New York through coastal Maine, were placed under active flood watches, as the same moisture and the same atmospheric setup moved east. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and areas around Boston and Portland found themselves suddenly facing the same kind of danger that had just devastated the capital region of New York, in places most Americans associate with quiet autumn foliage, not flash flood emergencies in the peak of summer. The National Weather Service placed a heightened risk of flooding rain across the corridor from Boston to coastal Maine, warning that lingering pockets of heavier rain could still produce dangerous, isolated flooding, even as the main storm weakened. This is the part most people watching from outside the region do not fully grasp. A flood watch does not mean the danger is theoretical. The National Weather Service defines a flash flood warning as meaning flooding is either already in progress, imminent, or highly likely. And officials have repeated again and again that most flood-related deaths happen inside vehicles, when drivers underestimate how deep water on a roadway actually is, or misjudge how quickly a shallow puddle can turn into a current strong enough to sweep a car off the road entirely. Officials across New York have used the exact same phrase over and over during this event. Turn around, don't drown. Never drive through a barricade. Even after water appears to recede, the ground underneath it may be completely unstable, hollowed out by the force of the current in ways that are invisible from above. Families who lived through this storm described conditions that came on with almost no warning. In several communities, residents in basement apartments were told directly by emergency management to move immediately to higher floors, because water was rising through building foundations faster than typical evacuation timelines allow. Officials in New York City itself, hundreds of miles downstream from where the worst of the rainfall fell, warned residents that flooding could still disrupt transportation, cause basement flooding, and require additional water rescues, even as the core of the storm sat well to the north. Farmland across the Hudson Valley, land that farmers depend on for their full annual income, was inundated by the heavy rains, with standing water sitting across fields at a point in the growing season when crops are especially vulnerable to being drowned out entirely. For a dairy farmer or a vegetable grower in Columbia or Greene County, a flood at this exact point in the summer does not just mean a delayed harvest. It can mean an entire season's crop rotting in waterlogged soil, feed supplies contaminated by floodwater, and access roads too damaged for delivery trucks to reach the farm at all, a financial hit that often is not fully felt until months later when the fall harvest simply does not materialize the way it should. This is where it becomes dangerous in a way that is easy to overlook if you are not from this region. The Hudson Valley's economy is built on small, close-knit communities where the local diner, the local farm stand, and the local hardware store depend on steady road access and steady customers. When a state of emergency shuts down travel for days at a time, as it did in Cairo and Columbia County, that is not just an inconvenience. It is lost income for small business owners who cannot simply reopen the moment the rain stops, because the roads leading to their doors may still be washed out, and their own basements or storage areas may still be sitting underwater. Power outages spread across multiple counties as downed trees and saturated soil brought lines down, and Governor Kathy Hochul issued a direct warning to residents to prepare for exactly that combination: power outages, downed trees, and continued road closures, stating plainly that everyone needed to take the weather seriously. Here is why this event deserves more attention than a typical summer storm. This was not an isolated freak occurrence. It was the latest entry in an accelerating pattern that scientists have been documenting for years, one where the same handful of ingredients, a stalled jet stream, a warming Arctic weakening the very system that used to keep storms moving, and an atmosphere primed by a strong El Niño, keep combining to produce flash flood emergencies that arrive faster, hit harder, and repeat more often than the historical record from just a few decades ago would ever have predicted. The capital region of New York has flooded before. Shodak's own town supervisor said publicly that the area has experienced flooding in the past, but that what happened this week was worse than anything he personally had ever witnessed there. When a local official who has lived through prior floods says this one was different, that is not hyperbole. That is a direct signal that the baseline for what counts as normal weather in this region has already shifted. What happens next is still being determined in real time. Cleanup crews across Columbia, Rensselaer, Greene, and Montgomery counties are working through washed-out roads, damaged infrastructure, and waterlogged homes, a process that officials say will take not days but weeks in some of the hardest hit communities. The full scope of the financial damage has not yet been calculated, but based on comparable events, including the $2.2 billion toll from the 2023 Northeast floods, officials expect the final numbers from this storm to run into the hundreds of millions of dollars at minimum once every washed-out road, every damaged home, every lost crop, and every disrupted business is accounted for. Meanwhile, the same moisture, the same instability, and the same atmospheric blocking pattern that caused this disaster in New York has not disappeared. It has simply relocated, and forecasters are continuing to monitor whether additional rounds of heavy rain could stall again over New England or double back toward the Hudson Valley before this pattern finally breaks down. The next several days could decide how much worse this gets before it gets better. Stream gauges across parts of the Northeast are still reporting flows dramatically above normal capacity, and officials have not ruled out additional flash flood warnings if any new rounds of rain move through ground that, in many of these communities, still has not finished draining from this event. Emergency managers in Columbia, Rensselaer, Greene, and Montgomery counties are asking residents to keep go bags packed, to keep phones charged in case power goes out again, and to avoid any temptation to sightsee near damaged roads or the collapsed mill site in Castleton-on-Hudson, since unstable ground and hidden debris remain a danger, even now that the water itself has receded in many spots. The search for the missing child in New Jersey remains a painful, unresolved thread hanging over this entire disaster, a reminder that behind every rainfall total and every record broken, there are real families waiting for answers that no forecast model can give them. In Castleton-on-Hudson, the family that owned the 300-year-old mill is left trying to figure out what, if anything, can be salvaged from a structure that survived every prior storm this region has thrown at it for 3 centuries, only to lose to this one. In Amsterdam, work crews are still assessing how much of West Main Street will need to be entirely rebuilt rather than simply repaired. In Cairo, officials have not yet given residents a firm date for when travel restrictions will be lifted or when Town Hall will reopen its doors. This storm system is still being studied, still being measured against the historical record, and in some ways, its full story has not finished being written. Forecasters continue to track additional moisture moving through the broader pattern, and communities from the Hudson Valley through New England are being told to stay alert rather than assume the danger has passed simply because the heaviest rain has moved on. What is certain right now is that the atmosphere over the Northeast is behaving differently than it did even a generation ago, and many people living through storms like this one still do not fully realize just how much that shift has already changed the ground beneath their feet. The next time a system like this one stalls over the Hudson Valley, and researchers tracking the trend say there will be a next time, the question will not be whether the region floods again. It will be whether the people living there had enough warning to get out of the water's path before it arrived.